So today I've got something special for some of those gaming masochists out there as we look at 26 challenging games for the NES and Famicom, one for each letter of the alphabet. And to keep things fresh, I'll be avoiding a lot of the typical titles you might see on many other Nintendo hard listicles out there. And that's not to dismiss the difficulty or quality of the well-known examples, but simply to showcase some of the more obscure but still unflinchingly brutal games to push your reflexes to their limits, recalibrate your brain meat, and thoroughly test your patience and resolve. And an obligatory disclaimer, game difficulty is highly subjective, and your mileage may vary, like how one person's Contra might be another person's Color a Dinosaur. And this list simply comes out of my experience of beating a wide variety of NES games over the years, and honestly, some of the games we'll cover today I still struggle with, but something keeps me coming back to them and giving them another shot. Let's check out some overlooked games from A to Z that are NES hard. So our adventure today does not begin in a bayou or on an island, but instead in a land of deadly dinosaurs and lethal lily pads. A is for Adventures of Dino Ricky from Hudson Soft, released in Japan in 1987 and North America in 1989. You control Dino Ricky in what basically amounts to a vertically scrolling shooter, but with some platforming in the mix since your little caveman dude mostly travels on foot. Aside from the typical onslaught of enemies and their projectiles, you'll also need to navigate through narrow passageways and hazardous landscapes. To make matters even more difficult, your default Dino Ricky at the start of a life is incredibly slow and weak, so you'll also need to make sure to harvest power-ups from various tiles to get your weapon and speed upgraded. Careful not to get too fast though, or the sketchy platforming sections will honestly just get even harder, and say goodbye to all your power-ups if you die. Dino Ricky does at least give you a little bit of a break in some ways. You can collect more health, the weapon upgrades are fairly plentiful, and they can get pretty powerful. And you might be lucky enough to find a special flying power-up that comes in super handy for avoiding those dangerous jumps entirely. Or maybe you'll even find the elusive Macho Ricky item. The game is also fairly short, with just 4 stages and pretty straightforward boss fights, and everything continues to loop arcade style after that. But man, that final level is a doozy. There's also no obvious way to continue if you run out of lives, but if you hold up and press start at the game over screen, you can keep going, no Hudson B required. Move over, Battletoads. Next up for the letter B is Bucky O'Hare, a run and gun and somewhat hidden gem that came out fairly late in the console's life cycle, released by Konami in 1992 and based on a short-lived comic and animated series. You start off controlling Bucky on a rescue mission to recover your missing crew spread out across the galaxy, to then become playable as well, and each with different weapons and special abilities, which you'll need to utilize often to get through very creatively designed stages and action set pieces. It's definitely got that high-quality Konami touch in all aspects, with a tough but fair difficulty curve, made even more approachable with unlimited continues, generous amounts of health and upgrades, and very reasonable checkpoints. But the main reason I'm bringing this one up today is for Bucky's infamous hard mode. And I tapped the shoulder of my buddy Junkyard Dave for some footage of his speedrun here, because I can't even clear the first planet with this enabled. Initially coded in as an anti-piracy measure on the Famicom cartridge, a routine verifies if copy prediction has been tampered with, and if so, forces a settings change that causes you to die in a single hit. You can also enter in a password to try this mode out for yourself, and brace yourself for one of the most insurmountable challenges on the system. Sections that were once somewhat trivial now feel near impossible. But as you can see, this mode that was probably never intended to be playable can actually be beaten with enough determination. And best of luck to you if you give this mode a shot. Now this one might look pretty cute on the surface, but trust me, it cuts deep. Chubby Cherub, also known as Obake no Kyutaro Wan Panic in Japan, was notably one of the first third-party developed games for the system, developed by Tosei and published by Bandai, with a Japanese release in 1985 featuring Kyutaro the mischievous dog-fearing ghost, and the reskinned North American version released in 1986, changing the character to a heart-flinging Cupid-like being, but he still hates dogs and eats Japanese snacks regardless. The gameplay takes a classic looping arcade game format with the main goal of reaching the end of each of the 12 stages to find your kidnapped friends. And there's plenty of dogs, birds, and other various critters trying to stop you. Where things get tricky here is that you have a power meter that must be maintained by eating food in order to keep flying. Otherwise, you'll have to traverse on foot, which rarely ends well. Your attack is also limited to collectible GOWs, so some efforts must be made in learning the stage's enemy placements and forming resource management plans to survive. Further complicating matters are layers of heaven and hell, with hell being punishing dark zones to navigate out of if you fall into a pit, and heaven being kinda tricky to get up to, but rewarding you with so much cake. There's also a really convoluted warping mechanic at play here, where if you can manage to only pick up food items from the right side of them throughout a stage, and then catch one of these smoke rings to the bonus area, you can simply coast past nearly the entire remainder of the level. It's weird, but it works. But even with hitting a few of these esoteric warps, expect lots of pain in this game. One-hit deaths, stiff controls, nasty moments of randomly spawning dogs, and a lack of continues will not make this one a smooth ride to finish all 12 stages. Next up, we'll delve into Dragon's Lair, providing us with an interesting take on the Laserdisc-based arcade classic from 1983, shifting the FMV trial and error style of gameplay into a side-scrolling platformer, but retaining the same absurd levels of challenge and numerous ways to perish. The plot also carries over, with Dirk the Daring on a quest to rescue Princess Daphne from the clutches of the evil dragon Singe. And you have to clumsily make your way through a castle decked out with numerous traps and monsters, many of which can kill you in one hit despite you having a health bar. A lot of the challenge here originates from Dirk's clunky controls and lengthy animations that delay your movements considerably. And the hazards before you are laid out in such a way that the game almost becomes a punishing puzzle game to figure out a safe passage through each area, even with some dastardly power-up placements that could potentially downgrade your weapon. And with only a handful of lives and no continues, brace yourself for a lot of work if you want to see this one through to the end. And don't forget to have a pillow nearby if you need something to scream into. This game is also eventually released in Japan and PAL regions with noticeable differences, especially including a dramatic increase in the game's speed, as shown in this Famicom version. While this does make it feel a little smoother and more fluid to control, it's still insanely hard. Luckily, these versions also have a secret 30 live code to give you a little more of a fighting chance. Alright, so I know this game technically starts with a number instead of a letter, but you know what else is difficult? Trying to fit Eliminator Boat Duel into any list. So instead we'll look at 8 Eyes, a Castlevania-flavored action game set in the 19th century Balkans if you're running the Japanese version, or set in a post-apocalyptic universe in the North American version. Either way, you're tasked with recovering 8 different jewels from 8 different dukes in 8 different castles. And where things get rough here is the fact that each boss gives you a new sword upon defeating them, but each boss is only vulnerable to one kind of sword. So it's like a Mega Man robot weakness situation here, but with a 1 out of 8 chance to be able to make any real progress. There are at least some hints scattered about throughout the stages, but no judgments here if you decide to just Google what order to play the levels in, because it's still pretty tough regardless. Combat is a bit finicky at first, especially once you mix in controlling your Falcon companion. A second player can really come in handy with that though, with one of the more unique examples of co-op play on the NES, where they can take full control of Cutress. To top things off, once you get all 8 jewels and take them to the final House of Ruth area, hopefully you also figured out the correct order to place them all, or get ready for a heartbreaking game over. And if we were to have a most obscure game of the list award here, it might have to go to Fire Bam, a Famicom Disk System exclusive released in 1988 by HAL Laboratory, with no releases outside of Japan and no other ports or sequels. It has a little bit of a Zelda 2 vibe, being an open-world, side-scrolling sword and board kind of thing, and also with the whole what the hell am I supposed to do next kind of vibe. There are basically long stretches of landscape with doors that take you either to other long stretches of landscape, or maybe item shops run by huge weird monster dudes, or dungeons reminiscent of the Zelda 2 palaces, or you might also get an absurdly fast-paced wind-blown auto-scrolling stage. Clearing dungeons also inexplicably stretches out the game world in an unusual way, and since everything still kinda looks the same, it's easy to get lost figuring out what changed every time that this happens. In all cases, you'll also need a bit of time to get used to the controls, with an awkward reliance on momentum to jump very far, and a pretty weak starting weapon without much reach. A lot of the enemies are also really fast, and might have funky hitboxes on top of this. And as you can guess, you'll need some patience as well to grind out enough fireball money things to upgrade your attack to something a bit more useful. It's not all pain and suffering though. We at least get the ability to save your game, and taking a death isn't super punishing. While you do get booted to the starting area, you get to keep all of your equipment and currency. Now, while I hesitate to call the Goemon franchise truly overlooked as a whole, with how many titles it's cranked out over the years, a lot of them never left Japan, and I still consider many of the games a bit underrated, and I at least wanted to bring up one of the first entries in the series in its first appearance on the Famicom with Ganbare Goemon Karakiri Dochu, released in 1986 by Konami. Following a similar formula to the original arcade game Mr. Goemon, it's kind of a top-down action game where you have to search for or perhaps purchase 3 passes required to move on to the next stage. The combat and platforming aren't really that difficult here, honestly, at least in the initial stages anyway, and there are plenty of items you can buy to get stronger or refill your health, but you'll have to thoroughly scour areas for hidden staircases by jumping around, like everywhere. There are no hints to where they might appear, so you just gotta jump a lot. Jumping is also how you uncover coins and items, so yeah, I hope you like jumping. But here's the real kicker that granted this an inclusion in today's difficulty-focused list. If you want to completely clear the game, you'll have to get through 13 stages 8 times. Yes, there are 8 loops and no passwords to pick up where you left off. So if you're doing this the old-fashioned way without save states, hopefully you have at least 5 hours set aside for this monumental task. And don't be afraid to use the special continue code. Hold A and B and press start in case you hit that dreaded game over screen. And I guess I gotta make this joke at least once in this video today. Here we have it, folks, the Dark Souls of snowboarding games. Heavy shredding. Admittedly on the janky side, but still kind of fun and addictive at times. Heavy Shreddin' is an Imagineering developed game, putting you through a variety of obstacle-laden events spread out over 3 different mountains, for a total of 18 short but totally gnarly levels. Events include downhill time attacks, half-pipe trick exhibitions, slalom courses, mogul jumping, and straight-up backwoods survival, all of which suffer a bit from perspective issues caused by graphical limitations and some unintuitive controls. Pair this with a lack of continues, and you've got a lot of work ahead of you to get the nuances down and memorize the hazards ahead. But at least you're rewarded with one of these screens every once in a while. Otherwise, get ready to get bruised up and beat down on these dangerous hills, and watch out for those killer deer. And next up, I is for the isometric shoot-'em-up Isolated Warrior, released in 1991 and developed by KID, who also produced quite a few other visually distinct and rather difficult NES titles. Typical of most shmups, you'll have to face plenty of enemies and bullets, and losing your power-ups when you die is pretty demoralizing. But Isolated Warrior ups the ante a bit considering the diagonal perspective, and while that is executed well and looks really cool, it still certainly takes some getting used to, and you might misjudge the trajectory of projectiles, and platforming can get pretty disorienting. Further escalating challenges come in the form of some frantically fast moments, massive hordes of enemies, and damaged sponge bosses, and some rather awkward phases of your weapon upgrades. Who actually wants a spread shot like this? Unlimited continues and passwords certainly even things out a bit, and there are also hidden item caches scattered about. But the real tryhards will want to take note of the true final 7th level and secret ending, only accessible by clearing the first 6 stages without dying. Or, passwords can help you out there too. Based on the cartoon series, based on the iconic spy character, James Bond Jr. on the NES was released in 1992, along with a different SNES title just 1 month later, with Eurocom on development duties here for a visually striking but brutally difficult action platformer. It only has 4 stages, but they're rather expansive areas that require a lot of exploration, and somewhat finicky combat with very healthy and rather annoying enemies. Having limited ammo doesn't help matters here either, not to mention a lengthy but still anxiety-inducing time limit per stage. And let's not forget the creme de la creme of challenge enhancements, slide puzzles. The bane of my existence. Might as well top things off with a mandatory 2-loop clear to get the true ending, although apparently the second loop has no difference in difficulty, so it's more of an endurance test at that point. I guess this one might leave you shaken, not stirred. I'm sorry. Well, it's about time we got a Vic Tokai jam in the mix here, with Kid Cool, The Quest for the 7 Wonder Herbs, an innocent-looking Mario-like platformer with some of the most sadistic level design and twisted platforming physics on the system. Part of an unofficial trilogy which includes Psycho Fox on the Sega Master System and Decap Attack on the Genesis, Kid Cool also shares similar design in the ability to throw a random critter thing at your enemies, and also some somewhat unwieldy running and jumping controls that rely heavily on momentum. It's all well and good, but the levels are laid out in a truly vicious way with tons of blind jumps, kaizo blocks, awkward vertical screen scrolling, and all sorts of other dirty tricks. So trial and error is in full effect here. Unlimited continues will help ease the pain a bit, but not so much if you want to get the best ending and actually save the king from his illness in time. And for that, you're going to need to beat this in 90 minutes of in-game time or less. Up next, let's take a look at a PAL region exclusive, The Legend of Prince Valiant, developed by Ocean Software and based on the cartoon series. Now, hearing ocean and licensed game in the same sentence might be enough to make you wince in the first place, but I think their back catalog is an ocean worth diving into for the occasional sunken treasure if you go deep enough. Prince Valiant is no exception, with a very capable hybrid genre title mixing up straightforward action platforming with first-person gallery shooting and some non-linear maze exploration as well. And it's no slouch, with plenty of traps and tricks to contend with and memorize, high levels of precision to survive the shooting sections, and lots of learning to be able to safely clear all 5 stages without running out of life, time, or your handful of continues. Level 3 is especially trying. Hopefully you don't have a fear of barrels. And perhaps the most accurately titled game in this list, it's Konami's Mission Impossible from 1990, published under their alternate Ultra Games moniker. It's a top-down action game reminiscent of the first Metal Gear, but with 3 different characters to pick from with different traits and devices at each of their disposals. Regardless of that flexibility, the game drops you into a non-linear hot mess of ruthless action, peppered with cryptic clues to figure out what you should actually be doing. It does have unlimited continues, but it's still immensely bewildering to figure out if you don't take any time to read the manual or maybe check out a walkthrough or two. And since you likely need to lean on each of your character's unique strengths during each stage, losing one of them to a small mistake can essentially cost you everything. I admittedly have not gotten very far at all in this one, but I've heard it's a really rewarding experience to achieve the impossible and conquer it. And hopefully I'll get around to taking on that task someday. Meanwhile, my sanity is going to self-destruct in 5 seconds. Oddly enough, we have another Ultra Games published title next in the alphabet with Nightshade, although development here was outsourced to Beam Software and has a much different feel from other Konami games of the era. At its core, Nightshade is a point-and-click adventure, so you'll often be flexing your brain muscles to figure out puzzles and make progress, which is no easy feat without a guide. On top of that, there are also occasional action sequences that are honestly pretty jank, so your reflexes and tolerance of rough controls will be tested. Some additional challenge is also introduced from a hardware limitation, as cost-cutting measures kept the developers from having a battery backup save system in the cartridges. But creatively, they did introduce a somewhat comical escape sequence puzzle every time you die, acting kinda like a continue system. But these are still limited to 4 attempts. Beyond that, and you'll have to start the game over from scratch. Next up, O is for Orb 3D, a rather odd reflex puzzle game that can quickly be described as one-player Pong with a Z-axis, and a rather unique experience on the NES. It was originally a computer game called Beyond the Black Hole, released in 1989 but ported to the NES the following year. And all versions were notably packaged with 3D glasses for enhanced stereoscopic visual effects, although the game is still playable without them. I'm tagging in another buddy, NES Atlas, here for some high-level gameplay footage, as this one is a real struggle for me to get a handle on. Gameplay has you deflecting an orb back and forth on the left and right sides of the screen, while you can also control a timed dive to try and hit various objects on the field. And clearing them all will move you on to the next level. Challenge escalates in the fact that there's often some kind of weird puzzly way to actually get rid of them. Meanwhile, your fuel is being depleted, and you may have to make occasional pit stops to get more, which also still requires some effort to pull off. 30 levels with a wide range of situations from bowling to spelling, and a lack of continues make this one a real toughie. It's still rather fun if you're looking for an off-kilter NES game that doesn't get enough attention. And we gotta dip into the challenging world of pinball gaming at least once today. In this case, I'm going with Pinbot, a rare developed recreation of the classic Williams pinball table. Seeing your balls go down the drain is just a normal and expected part of pinball, but there are a few things to set this apart from the original physical experience. Obviously, there is a learning curve to adapt to the in-game physics versus reality. They did a commendable job here, really, and even have a rudimentary screen shake tilt for a little bit of help in the controls department. And with enough experience, you'll probably figure out what not to do if you want to avoid those deadly outlanes or other various out-of-control situations. But if you really want to go far in this game, you'll have to advance the board up through 6 different levels by hitting a solar loop during a multi-ball, with each playfield featuring a different new dangerous kind of enemy, like a marauding blob that wants to eat you, or maybe even ships firing missiles at your flippers to take them out of commission. Topping the in-game leaderboard and rolling over your score to see the final game credits is no easy feat that will require total mastery and a bit of luck too. Now, there aren't a lot of options out there for the letter Q, and although the arcade classic conversions of Q*bert and Kix are pretty great and definitely hard as nails, I wanted to go a little bit more obscure and bust out some Quarth, a shmup puzzle hybrid released by Konami, originally in arcades, but also ported to Japanese home computers, the Game Boy, and the Famicom. You control a ship at the bottom of the screen and must fire blocks upwards to form rectangles or squares from the other blocks falling towards you in order to clear them. If any stray block hits the bottom line, you lose a life. It starts out easy enough in the early stages to get you familiar with the mechanics and learn how some of the occasional power-up items work, but the speed and quantity of the blocks ramp up over the course of the 10 different levels, with the hectic final stage being a truly unforgiving test of your reflexes and quick thinking skills. Luckily, losing a life will clear the screen and let you keep going, and you can also start on any level you like, making this an addictive one to keep you coming back and trying again and again. Originally released for a shooting game competition in Japan known as Summer Carnival '92, Rekka has gone on to be a bit of a grail for Famicom collectors, but has also gained low-key infamy as one of the most hectic and intense shmups on the system. Developed by KID and published by Naxat Soft, Rekka pushes the limits of the console with insane speed, numerous simultaneous sprites on the screen, and psychedelic visual effects, topped off with an auditory assault of textured techno to get your pulse pounding even harder. I can unfalteringly agree that this is one of the most hardcore shmups on the system, and perhaps the closest thing to bullet hell that you could find in that era. There's so much going on at once, but at least numerous power-ups give you a variety of ways to destroy your enemies, not to mention a glowing orb shield that can be charged up and unloaded as a devastating attack. Despite this, Rekka really does not care about your feelings, with unrelenting waves of foes, and probably to no surprise considering that this is a competition cart, no continues allowed, and there's even a second loop with reworked stages. There are a couple of other game modes worth checking as well, a time attack, a score attack, and the hidden Zenki attack, which gives you 50 lives, but is still absolutely insane, as enemies will produce more projectiles upon their destruction. Good freaking luck. And if Rekka wasn't hardcore enough for you, it's time for some soul-crushing billiards action with Data East's Side Pocket. I'll laugh all you want, maybe this is a skill issue on my end, but in my 7 years of streaming random games on Twitch, Side Pocket still stands out as one of the most difficult clears in my personal history. At first glance, it's a pretty standard-looking, unassuming game of pool, but it does have very solid physics and represents the original arcade version quite faithfully. It also has its own unique rules, and some other interesting game mechanics, my favorite being able to enter the zone. Pocket mode puts you in a series of 4 matches, but you have to maintain enough of what you could consider health in order to reach the end. Not to mention little trick shot precision challenges in between. That doesn't sound like much, but as I mentioned earlier, this one had so many hours of toil and struggle when I was tackling it for a Data East challenge a few years ago. But even if you decide not to try and beat this one, it's still a really fun little title to pick up and play, especially with 2 people.
Max power. Oh, that's fucking it! Yes! We fucking did it! Ah, yeah! Ah, world champion, game winner. I'm free. Ah!
Next up in the list for the letter T is Time Lord, developed by Rare and published by Milton Bradley. And just a year prior to their infamously brutal Battletoads, Rare made this action platformer beat-em-up hybrid, where you must save the world from aliens by traveling through time, thwarting their plans to weaken humanity in various phases of history. Each stage takes place in a different setting and time period, and you'll need to collect 5 orbs in each to power your time machine and move on to the next, with 1 orb being guarded by a boss that probably has a crap ton of health. At first, the orbs are pretty much just sitting out in plain sight, but gradually they become more hidden and puzzling to obtain, sometimes requiring rather unusual means of acquisition. The game gets unforgiving in a few ways with a lack of continues available, and an overall time limit requiring that you beat the entire game in about 36 minutes. This is one of those weekend rentals from childhood that weirdly stays stuck in my brain despite its jank, and actually finishing it has still evaded me to this day. The Untouchables, more like unbeatable, am I right? Based on the film and converted from the Commodore 64 game released prior, this licensed title from Ocean essentially amounts to a multi-genre exercise with a handful of minigames taking you through various events from the movie, with several shooting gallery-style levels, a run-and-gun platforming stage, and even an escort mission recreating the memorable baby carriage rolling down the stairs scene. What makes this game brutally hard hits you right off the bat in the very first shooting stage, with a strict time limit leaving little room for mistakes, and very little reaction time offered for avoiding taking damage, especially when your shooting reticule simply cannot move fast enough to accommodate for all these guys popping out of windows. One thing that might help out though is that this actually had a revised version of the cart released, with the second iteration reordering and reworking the stages a little bit, most importantly improving the controls during this border raid stage. So choose your version accordingly, depending on what you want to inflict upon yourself. And V is for Valis, in this Famicom port of the first title of this deep cut series starring a Japanese schoolgirl tasked with defending the Earth from demons with a magical sword. Technically, you might see this one titled Mugen Senshi Valis, but I couldn't think of a more fittingly frustrating game for this letter. While later games in the series would usually be action platformers reminiscent of classic Castlevania titles, the first Valis was an open-world action adventure where it's very easy to get lost and confused. The backgrounds all kinda look the same, and various exits on the screen might take you in a different direction than you might expect. A lot like the NES Rambo, in case you've ever played that one. Eventually you might find a map, but it's still confusing as hell to track down the items you need. Luckily, there is a fan-made enhanced patch, which not only translates the game, but also amends some of the more troublesome aspects, so you might want to give that Valis++ version a shot if you have any interest in the series. Otherwise, the original is a true test of your willingness to draw your own maps and slog through things as the developers originally intended. And it's time to go beast mode here with Werewolf: The Last Warrior from Data East, an action platformer with a little bit of Ninja Gaiden on its sleeve, and maybe a little bit of Altered Beast as well. With the right power-up, you can change out of your woefully inferior human form, who is limited to punching and yelling no, and instead become an overpowered werewolf with giant blade hands that can also perform invincible backflips and howl your enemies to death. Now, while the game is considerably easier while in wolf form, it's not easy to stay that way, as dipping your health too low will revert you back. There are even blue W item drops that will expedite this process. And that's not to say this game is a cakewalk if you're a wolf most of the time. It still has immense levels of punishment ahead, along with a limited amount of lives. The waterfall stage is especially traumatic, with numerous hazards knocking you to a watery demise. I will at least mention there is a helpful glitch that can be abused at the start of the game that will put you in a permanent super werewolf form, at least if you can manage to stay alive. So maybe check out some speedruns of the game if you want a little extra help there and aren't afraid of going for a deathless clear. So there aren't a ton of games to pull from for the letter X. You've got the atrocious port of a cool arcade game with Xenophobe, and a great but not overly difficult platformer shmup hybrid in Xexes. So I guess that leaves us with Xevious, a port of Namco's 1983 arcade shoot-'em-up classic. Admittedly, it feels a little odd to call this game overlooked, as it was highly influential for its time and was a massive success in Japanese arcades. But I would call it the most challenging game from our three choices, and perhaps you could say it has been a bit neglected lately, in the fact that the last proper entry in the series was Xevious Resurrected in 2009, buried in a Namco collection on the PS3. But getting back to the NES version, it's an effective port of the arcade original in that it's still hard as nails. It may feel a bit antiquated if you're pitting it against other NES shmups at the time, but you're still going to have a tough time getting through all 16 stages without any means of upgrading your weapon or ship speed. There's also an interesting mechanic of the game where it gradually throws harder enemies at you as you become more skilled at destroying them. And why just might be the question you ask yourself as you die over and over again in Yo Noid, a platformer from Capcom starring the Noid, the kind of weird mascot for Domino's Pizza at the time. Originally, this was a game called Kamen no Ninja Hanamaru, but reskinned for North American release to promote the national pizza chain while retaining the original gameplay of the Famicom title. This is probably one of the more reasonably beatable games in today's list, but it still has pain points of dying in one hit, some tricky and trolly platforming, slippery controls, and a couple janky vehicle-based stages. And don't get me started on some of the rigged card game battles, which eventually require that you had collected enough of the right items during a previous stage in order to power up your pizza chomping and out-eat your opponent. This game does at least have a handful of continues, but you're going to need them to learn your way through this one. Last but definitely not least, Z is for Xanac. Developed by Compile and honestly one of my favorite shmups in the NES library. Originally released in 1986 on the MSX and Famicom Disk System, Xanac was immensely impressive at the time for having so much hectic action happening on the screen while maintaining a very brisk scrolling pace with very little slowdown. It also features a mechanic similar to the previously mentioned Xevious, where the gameplay adapts to your playstyle, throwing different combinations of enemies at you depending on what weapons you have and how much you're shooting. On top of the usual lose all your power-ups if you die situations, which can be incredibly difficult to recover from, the game is also rather lengthy, clocking in at 12 stages, and can get a bit exhausting with how frantic it often feels. but getting your favorite power-up and managing to lock into that groove of crushing wave after wave of enemies is immensely satisfying. And it's an easy recommendation from me if you want a tough but fair experience. And that wraps up our list today. I hope you enjoyed this new format I'm trying out here, and I'm looking forward to putting together similar off-the-wall A to Z lists in the future. And make sure to drop a comment if you've got any other brutal NES games to recommend that you feel don't get talked about enough. Or you could brag that every game in this list is easy and you beat them all when you're 5 years old. Everyone loves that. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time.